What's up guys, it's Double Zug. So Spine of Deathwing, I know this guide's a little bit late and my Madness guide's going to be a little bit later, but you know, it is what it is. So this boss is very complicated from a tank POV and a DPS POV, and if I did like a full guide going through every single mechanic and every single possible strategy, it would be really, really long. So this guide is going to be very, very healer POV. I'm just going to talk about only the things that are relevant to the healers, and I'm going to talk through all the different things that you should be doing on each spec. This fight is very, very highly comp restrictive. If you've been doing attempts on this fight with the 0%, you'll know that. If you're in any kind of normal guild where you don't have access to like the absolute best composition for this fight, you might potentially need to wait for even more debuff than the 5%. However, this fight does get very, very significantly easier with every single 5% debuff that we do get in the raid. Alright, so let's just really quickly go through the healer relevant mechanics and then I'll get into specifics. So as you drop down onto the spine, you'll see these corruption tentacles. These are very important adds in the fight. You, as a healer, shouldn't really have to worry about managing these too much and like breaking grips and stuff like that, killing them off. You can pretty much just ignore them and let your DPS and tanks deal with them. What these corruptions will do is when they die, they will spawn the Amalg, which is the add that the tank is going to be tanking and killing to expose the tendon. Again, you don't really have to worry about managing Amalgs as a healer. These corruptions have a grip that they will cast intermittently, which will stun 3 players and do significant damage to them. As a healer, you shouldn't really have to be worried about breaking these outside of extreme circumstances. So the only thing you really have to do with grip is just have it tracked on your raid frame so you can be sure to heal those players if they get the grip. The third and most important things that the corruptions will do from a healer POV is spread a debuff on the raid that will do a huge amount of healing absorb. This debuff that you can see going out here is tracked on Fogies with this bar that shows how much healing absorb is left. Managing this healing absorb is going to be the most important thing we do as a healer on this fight, and our healing composition is going to be structured around being very effective at healing these off and having good cooldowns to prevent players with the debuff from dying during the high periods of burst damage. Once we kill the 3 corruptions and spawn the 3 first Amalgs, we're going to be rolling these off. If all the players on Deathwing Spine move to one side, Deathwing will roll that way, and everyone that isn't inside the dead body of one of these tentacles will get rolled off, as well as any Amalgs will also get rolled off. So you can see the Amalgs are going to fly off the spine pretty soon here. But before they do, they're going to be casting this debuff that you can see marked very clearly by Fogies here. It starts out as red and it has a 16-second duration. This debuff has a very similar play pattern to Rack from Sinestra. However, it's actually a lot simpler than Rack in my opinion. You're basically going to spam Dispel on this debuff until it turns yellow. And then once it turns yellow, you're going to spam Dispel on it until it goes onto one of the tanks. And we're going to have some positioning to ensure this goes on the tanks, so I'll talk about it a little bit later. The tendon is exposed by killing off bloods and getting the amalgamation to eat their residue. Whenever bloods are killed, it will do a small physical AoE on the raid, which will damage even players with the healing absorb. And as the amalgamation gains stacks, it will do more damage to the tank that's holding it. Once the amalgamation dies, it will start pulsing AoE and will do a very large AoE that you just have to step out of in order not to die. However, the management of amalgamations and bloods is pretty much out of your hands as a healer, and you don't really have to think about it other than the fact that you should be focusing the tank with a little bit more healing when those amalgamations do get more stacks. So that's it. That's pretty much all the mechanics you actually have to know about as a healer. So now let's go through each mechanic and talk a little bit more in depth about them. Let's start with positioning for the Dispel. All right, so we have our trusty paint back open here. So we're going to talk about the positioning for the Dispel. So let's imagine this is Deathwing and we're going to give him a little bit of color. All right, so let's imagine this is Deathwing. This is the bottom and top of the plate, and you have your corruptions here. So when we drop down from the ship, the raid is going to kind of be loosely stacked in the middle. We're going to be killing 3 of these tentacles and spawning 3 Amalgs. The raid's going to move to one of these little tentacle corpses and get gripped so that we can roll all the Amalgs off. But before the Amalgs get rolled off, they're going to cast 3 debuffs. So the way that we're going to deal with that is we're going to have the raid kind of stacked here, right? For the roll, you're just going to be healing and healing and healing. The debuffs have a long enough duration that you shouldn't have to dispel while you're in the roll. You just want to wait because you're going to have, you know, damage to heal while you're rolling. You don't want someone to die from the roll or the grip dot while you're dispelling. However, if the dispels do go out a little bit too early before the roll, you may need to dispel them during the roll. This can be quite dangerous, especially later on the fight. In the first roll, you aren't going to be taking very much damage at all, so it's perfectly safe to dispel them early. After the roll, we're going to be splitting the boss in half along the middle ridge of the spine. We're going to have the raid stacked on one side of the spine, and we're going to have all the players that we want to have the DR on the other side of the spine. So this is going to be the tanks, whether you have 2 or 3 tanks, it's up to you. You're going to have all the tanks stand over here. You're going to be dispelling the red debuff until it turns to a yellow debuff. And once you have the yellow debuff, you're going to be dispelling the yellow debuff until it jumps to one of these tanks. Once it jumps to one of these tanks, the tank that has that yellow debuff is going to move to the other side. And then you're going to keep dispelling these yellow debuffs until one jumps to the other tank. You're going to repeat this process where they go to the other side until all of your tanks have this yellow debuff. The reason we do this positioning is that the yellow debuff prefers to jump across the spine. So by isolating only the players you want to have on one side of the spine, you can basically guarantee that you will always get the yellow debuff on them. Once the yellow debuff expires, it will give the player a permanent 40% damage reduction. So having this on the tanks is very, very useful, especially for the later sections of the fight where the tanks are going to be taking quite a lot of damage. If we do this first section of the fight properly, we should be able to get all of our tanks with the yellow debuff. Once we have all of our tanks with the yellow debuff, we no longer have to do this positioning game at all for the subsequent plates. Every other plate we can pretty much just spam dispel on red until it turns yellow, and then all we have to do with that yellow is make sure that it goes on somebody who doesn't already have that DR. So once we have all of our debuffs on our tanks, we just are going to move the raid back to the middle. We're going to have a range stack. The range stack can be pretty far back on the first plate, almost touching the wall. It is important though as a healer to be positioned in such a way that your mock conal healing will heal the raid stack. Once you get to plate 2, you will only have to replicate this debuff positioning where you kill your corruption, spawn some Malags, those Malags put debuffs out, you're going to roll, and then you're going to have the tanks move to the other side. You only, again, have to do this if you didn't get your debuffs right on the plate 1. Otherwise, you can just straight away move from the roll, just have the raid stack up in the center and go back to your normal positioning. In terms of which healers should be doing the dispelling, it should be healers that are not mana constrained. So Disc Priest is good for this, Resto Shaman is good for this. However, when the Tendon is up, if you do get a debuff when the Tendon is up, your healers like your Disc Priest and your Resto Shaman should be doing damage to the Tendon, in which case healers like Paladin can do the dispels just when the Tendon is out to increase your damage on the Tendon if you are having trouble with the damage on the Tendon. However, with the 5% debuffs rolling out, you shouldn't be having as much trouble on damage on Tendon, so it can be safer to just have your healers heal while the Tendon is out if your damage on them is very comfortable. So now that we've talked about dispels, let's talk about the healing absorb. So this is actually a very, very interesting and compelling healer mechanic. The damage pattern of this fight is very unique in that it's sort of like a spread, consistent single target healing fight, and throughout the entire duration of the fight, we are going to be managing these healing debuffs, healing them off not so quickly that we run out of mana, but quickly enough that we don't go into the amalgamation AoEs or the roll AoEs with so many debuffs that players will die due to having those healing absorbs on them while they take AoE. We will also get a stacking maximum HP debuff as we kill more and more Amalgs as the fight goes on, which will ramp up the damage relative to our health pools. This is not something you really have to pay attention to or track. It doesn't really change your play pattern all that much. It basically just means that the amount of damage you take and the amount of danger you're in will ramp up as the fight goes on. This relatively unique damage pattern of having to do consistent spread single target healing will preference certain playstyles that might not necessarily be played in any other fight in this expansion, which is kind of interesting. I do think this is actually a very, very good healer fight, despite being kind of a miserable fight to tank and DPS. And in the interest of talking about how to clear these debuffs, I'm actually going to go first over healing composition, and I'm going to go through the specs and the play patterns of each spec individually. The ideal healing composition for this fight is going to be double HPAL as our core. HPAL obviously just insanely broken in every fight, but also quite strong on this fight because of how Beacon works. We're next going to have 2 or 3 Resto Shamans. Resto Shaman is also quite powerful on this fight, mostly for its cooldowns. The potential 6th healing slot is a little bit more flexible. You can pretty much bring anything here. Disc Priest brings a little bit more damage, whereas something like a Holy Priest or a Resto Druid is going to bring more efficient, consistent healing onto those debuffs. However, I personally do think that the Resto Druid and the Holy Priest is going to bring a little bit more to the composition than a Disc Priest, assuming that you have enough damage on the tendons. So I'm going to go through each healer and look at a spec and glyph setup and talk about just general play patterns for this fight. So starting with Holy Paladin, you're just going to be running a standard build for Paladin. You don't really need the Podge spec, and the Wog talents are okay here. You're not really going to be wogging that much though, honestly, so it doesn't really matter whether or not you do Podge or the Wog stuff. The main thing to talk about here is just glyphs. So this is 100% a Glyph of Beacon of Light fight. This makes your beacon free, and because we're going to be using our beacon throughout the first 2 plates to clear those debuffs really effectively, we're going to be swapping our beacon a huge amount. And so having this is just going to save us a huge amount of mana. So if you look at this like rank 2 log, we can see that he cast Beacon of Light 17 times over the course of the fight. So that would be like 30k mana saved by this glyph, so pretty strong. So I think it's 100% worth to take this glyph on this fight. I would also take Glyph of Wall. It's really nice to have that 40% DR for every roll and every Amalgdeth. As for play pattern on this fight, all the like high rank logs are just going to be Holy Radiance spamming. However, especially if you're like 6 healing with the debuff, you don't really need to be doing Holy Radiance spamming too much, but it's fine. It is very efficient, and it does do splash healing onto the debuffs, as well as if you are beacon swapping aggressively, your Light of Dawn is going to be doing a huge amount of healing onto those debuffs. So as a Paladin, I would default to this kind of Holy Radiance LOD playstyle and swapping to like a spamming a Divine Light playstyle if you do ever fall behind on those debuffs. When it comes to Wings DF, I would pretty much just try to use them on CD. However, if you are having trouble living through the rolls or Amalgdeths and you don't have a bunch of Resto Shamans to do Spirit Link, you can schedule those Wings and Divine Favor around a roll or a tendon. Both Guardian and Lay on Hands are incredibly powerful cooldowns on this fight because they're very, very powerful single target throughput abilities. You should be saving them for emergencies where you get somebody with a healing absorb who either gets gripped or is at very low HP. Lay on Hands will basically instantly clear one of the debuffs, and your Guardian will allow you to also instantly clear those debuffs just with a couple of Divine Lights, as well as doing some incidental splash healing to the raid as well. So again, your main play pattern on Holy Paladin is going to be Radiance LOD if you're ahead, and if you're behind, you'll be swapping your beacon to the most in danger player who has a healing absorb, spamming Divine Light into that beacon target, and using your Tower of Radiance Holy Power to LOD into the raid. So not a huge departure from the typical Holy Paladin playstyle. The main difference here is going to be aggressively using that beacon swapping for the first 2 plates before swapping your beacon back onto the tanks if those tanks are in danger later in the fight, where they'll be taking a lot more damage. When it comes to Holy Priest, there's like super few logs out there Holy Priest have actually killed the fight, but I think Holy Priest is decently strong here, especially if you take proper advantage of Lightwell. If the players who actually get the healing absorb do click the Lightwell, this spell is pretty insane and can do a lot of healing. When it comes to specs for this fight, I try to grab points in Divine Fury. There's potentially a playstyle here where you sit in your single target chakra and you roll your renews on the healing absorb targets with your single target heals, particularly later in the fight where there's going to be more debuffs and your other healers like your H-Pals are going to be more focused on beaconing into the tanks. You might be able to pick up quite a lot of efficiency there. However, most of the top logs on this fight from Holy Priest are either just spamming Prayer of Healing, or it's like Lightwater, who, while he is doing the renew-based playstyle, he chose not to do the single target chakra and just stayed in AoE chakra and kept his Sanctuary down and just spread renews manually. So it kind of remains to be seen whether or not that single target chakra play is viable. It's potentially good if you have like less healers focusing on those debuffs, maybe. I don't know where the breakpoint is there. You get a little bit of benefit here if you are playing the Renew style as well, because you can take both Glyph of Lightwell and Glyph of GS. GS is a pretty strong cooldown here, both for the tanks in the end of the fight, as well as for clearing debuffs really quickly. And again, Lightwell is very, very powerful if people actually click the Lightwell. It can do a huge amount of healing on this fight very effectively. The one other thing I'll mention here, this goes for both Disc Priest and Holy Priest, although it is kind of a pipe dream. Glyph of Spirit Tap can do something on this fight if you can actually consistently snipe killing blows on bloods that are low, but that is, again, kind of a pipe dream, honestly. But if you can actually manage to do that, is decent. So again, for Holy Priest playstyle, you're either going to be doing the renew spamming stuff, or you're going to be just spamming POH. However, there is a little bit of room there for experimentation with your single target chakra on those healing absorbs. Discipline Priest, I honestly found this spec to be kind of a little bit homeless feeling on this fight, honestly. If you just spam Atonement, you don't really contribute that much, especially now that damage with the debuff isn't going to be as important on like the Malgs and the Tendons and stuff like that. If you spam POH, you're kind of just sniping healing from the healing range that are going to be down, because you're going to be having Resto Shamans for SLT, as well as you're just kind of sniping healing from Radiance that the Paladins are going to be doing. However, if you do want to parse on the fight, you will just be spamming POH the entire time. So either way there, you kind of feel a little bit weak as a Disc Priest here. You do bring Barrier, which is a very, very powerful healing cooldown, but it's just not as powerful as a Spirit Link. Your Power Word Shield on low health healing absorb targets is quite nice, as it will protect their HP pool, especially later on in the fight where your maximum HP debuff is really high. Power Word Shield can save people's lives, but that's not like incredibly powerful. The one sort of like alternative weird techie thing that I was experimenting with early on in pulls was this Train of of Thought, Surge of Light, Greater Heal build. If you are like locked on disc for this fight and you are struggling to churn through those healing absorbs, this is a potential option here. What this basically does is just maximizes the efficiency and throughput of your Greater Heal. You're going to be stacking Grace with Penance on those debuff targets and then spamming Greater Heal. Train of Thought will churn out those inner focuses, and this talent plus Surge of Light is just going to dramatically increase the efficiency of your Greater Heal. The problem with this is that Greater Heal isn't like really the greatest button, and you're really not the best out of the healers at all at churning through those debuffs, so you're better off just like playing a different spec or just like kind of spamming POH or doing Atonement, honestly, as a Disc Priest and letting your other healers churn through those debuffs. However, if you do want to like play around with this a little bit, it is kind of interesting, kind of fun. But if you aren't doing that, you will just be bringing like a pretty much just a standard build. You don't really need inspiration for this fight, especially given that you will be having so many Resto Shamans on most compositions. I would always take Glyph of Barrier to this. Again, you know, Glyph of Spirit Tap is potentially kind of cool here, especially given that on Disc Priest, you can wear your Shadow 2 set, which will juice your Shadow Word Death a little bit and make it easier to get this to proc. If you can get a couple procs of this, it is like kind of insanely valuable, but again, this is like kind of a pipe dream, honestly. For Resto Shaman on this fight, there's a couple of different options here. I would always take Totem Duration. You really want that extra duration on both your Spirit Link and your Mana Tide on this fight. Mana can be kind of tight, and your Mana Tide is going to have a huge amount of value with 5 or 6 healers, and your SLT is going to make the whole raid basically like immortal to damage during the very dangerous parts of the fight, which are those rolls and those Amalg deaths. Really, the other options here are just points in Dispel and Nature's Blessing. If you don't want to take Dispel, I would err towards taking Dispel just because you have infinite mana with Caloric Currents, and you know, spamming Dispel for you is a little bit easier than for something like a Holy Paladin. But if you don't have to take Dispel, I would probably take a point in Improved Shields. Your Mana Shield is going to be proccing a lot on this fight, so you're going to get a lot of value from that extra mana, as well as just 5% extra on your Earth Shield, which isn't terrible. Also, if you want to err on the defensive side, you can take points in Ancestral Resolve over points in Nature's Blessing. This is just going to be a little bit more throughput. At this point in gear as well, you should have enough hit cap with 2 in Elemental Precision, so you can get a sneaky extra point there. When it comes to play patterns for Resto Shaman in this fight, if you do want to parse and just maximize your HPS, it's going to be basically the typical playstyle of keeping your Flame Shock healing rain down, keeping your Riptide on CD, riptiding those fresh healing debuff targets, and then filling with your Chain Heal. However, there's also a lot of interesting, like really powerful stuff you can do to clear the healing debuffs. In the interest of clearing those healing debuffs on this fight, I do utilize spell batching with Unleash Elements quite frequently. If you Unleash Elements and get the buff, and then cast a Greater Healing Wave and spell batch in a Riptide on the GCD, you will get that 30% extra benefit on both of those spells. And given that, you know, Riptides into healing debuff targets or into the tanks are going to be very low overhealing on this fight, you can get a huge amount of value that way. So that's something you can take advantage of to be a little bit more efficient and a little bit faster at clearing those debuffs off. However, again, if you do want to parse, you will just be doing the very typical Resto Shaman. Keep your Empowered Healing Rain down, Riptide on CD, and then Chain Heal into the raid. But really the reason why we're bringing Resto Shamans to this fight is not really for their throughput, it is for that Spirit Link Totem. Spirit Link Totem is incredibly powerful on this fight. It's both good for making the players with healing debuffs basically immortal to damage, despite having the giant healing absorb on them, as well as clearing those debuffs, particularly during the dangerous parts of the fight being the rolls and the amalgamation deaths. The safest possible composition for this fight involves 3 Restoration Shamans, because with 3 Restoration Shamans, you can have a Spirit Link Totem for every single roll and every single tendon lift. This is a little bit overkill, especially with the debuffs coming out here though. If you only have 2 Restoration Shamans, I'd recommend Spirit Linking the Amalg deaths and stacking your other healer cooldowns like Hymn, Trank, Barrier, etc. for the rolls. So that's all the spec glyph stuff I'd talk about, and just like a very basic outline of the play patterns for all the healers. Now I'm going to talk through a kill video here. So because of how our comp worked out, I actually swapped to a Resto Shaman alt here rather than my Disc Priest. Getting up to that 2 SLT number is like actually really important, and it's worth like swapping around and flexing for, honestly. The SLT is just incredibly powerful. And I also found that just Disc Priest, I felt kind of like useless. I was just either atomenting or like kind of spamming POH the whole fight. And it didn't really feel super useful, so I figured I'd just swap to my Resto Shaman, given that I do have enough alts and enough healers around with lockouts to flex for the raid. So you can see there we did the positioning for the first debuff, and we got this debuff on all 3 of our tanks. We do have a Feral here who's going to be Cat most of the fight, and then Bear at the end, and we have 2 Blood DKs. Pretty decent comp here. We are 5 healing this with the 5% debuff. If you were progging with 0%, you'd probably want 6. Now I think you can pretty much get away with 5, especially if you have like 2 SLTs and some decent healer CDs. Although, you know, with that HP debuff, your damage is going to be a lot less tight, so you can flex up to 6, especially if you're 2 tanking. You know, just kind of depends. Don't be afraid to go up healers if you do have the damage to kill those tendons in 2 lifts. It is just, you know, safer. So this first plate here, the damage is like pretty low, so you can just be very safe with healing these absorbs off. You can see I'm being pretty aggressive with my mana just because, I don't know, I just like doing HPS. And those healing debuffs are getting blasted off there. It's very useful to go into here. You can see we do get our SLT there, and inside that SLT, we are pretty much just immortal to damage. One thing to mention here, I'm just going to back up really quickly, is that the Amalg, especially if it like is tanked not super perfectly flush to the plate here, this AoE that it does, you know, it can kind of just one-shot you if you stand in it, so try to get everybody to actually move back. You can have some pretty stupid wipes on prog to people just dying to that nuclear blast. You can also see here, I am trying to get a little bit of extra damage in on the tendon lifts. This is a really good opportunity to both get value on your damage as a shaman and also get mana back. Disc Priest can do damage into the tendon. Your other healers, though, I wouldn't really recommend it. You can see there are still, like, that debuff is going out, and we also do have some absorbs still on the raid, so your, like, H-Pals, your Holy Priests, your Resto Druids, you can just pretty much be healing into those debuffs. A few 100,000 extra healer damage shouldn't be the difference between lifting the tendon and not, but if it is, then of course you can always have your healers do a little bit of like wrathing or exorcisming or whatever. So again, just back to this first play here, damage is quite low. We haven't really gotten that high stacks on our maximum HP reduction here, so this is very, very much so just kind of spinning your wheels as a healer, trying to be a little bit mana neutral. Being mana neutral is of course not as important on Resto Shaman because you have Telluric Currents, but on your other healers you should be trying to, you know, be decently mana neutral and be very, very efficient healing off those absorbs so that you can blast through them before the Amalg deaths and before the rolls. So you can see here for this nuclear blast, it's going to be my Spirit Link. I do walk out a little bit to drop it so that the melee as they're running in get a little bit of extra range. You can have some kind of dumb melee deaths if people don't run to the Spirit Link. It's very important that you're obviously inside the Spirit Link to get the benefit there. And I don't really do too much damage to that tendon just because, again, we have more than enough damage. If you don't have more than enough damage, you can be doing things like Flame Shock, Lava Burst, you know, that kind of thing. You can see we have like a square marker here. This is our stack marker for the range. To make sure that your ranged are trying to be as pixel stacked as possible, you should have all your healers with Maw on this fight. That splash healing on 5 or 6 healers is really, really powerful. Well worth like trying to yell at people to be perfectly stacked so that you can get good value on that conal healing. You also should try to have your ranged. You can see we have a range stack about here and our melee are just kind of around here. Try to have your ranged and melee both within healing range distance of each other and be positioning your healing rains properly so that you can heal the entire raid and the tanks and everything. I use Plater, and you can see that I have the nameplates for oozes just like completely disabled. There's a little Plater mod that I'll actually just link in the description below that you can use. It's very low weight that will just turn off the nameplates for your oozes entirely. This is not like the best idea. If you're like a DPS or a tank, you kind of want to be able to see where the low oozes are. But as a healer, you really don't need to see the ooze nameplates, and it can be very, very messy, especially, you know, if you're trying to target the Amalg for like atonement healing or your Telluric Currents mana, if there's just millions of nameplates all over the screen. So you can see again another nuclear blast and another Spirit Link totem. And those Spirit Links just make those sections just incredibly safe. And again, just doing some Telluric Currents mana into the tendon. You can see I'm also trying to focus the tanks just before that tendon pops and before the Amalg casts Nuclear Blast. Ideally, the Amalg shouldn't have like 8-9 stacks of the, you know, Absorb Ooze or whatever for very long, but while that is up, the tank is going to be taking quite significant amounts of damage, even with that full like 40% DR from the yellow buff. So be sure to like be casting into them, riptiding into them instead of a healing debuff before that happens. This is also a really good fight for like DPS mana cooldowns, so your Shadow Priest Hymn, your like DPS or Feral Druid Innervates, every little thing can help your healers a lot here, and because It's not really a DPS race on the ads, it's basically just a DPS race on the tendons. You have a huge amount of downtime where it's basically perfectly free for your DPS to mana him, innervate you, etc. So if your DPS aren't doing that, it can be useful as a healer to call that out. So you can see another nuclear blast here, and I'm sending my Spirit Link totem. Because your Earth totem like spawns in the same place relative to your character, you can see I like turn there a little bit just to get my Earth totem out a little bit further so that these melee that are running in get hit by it quicker. Not a huge deal there though. You know, your melee, if they're properly positioned, will always be inside that Spirit Link. And you can see I'm just lightning bolting into the tendon, but prioritizing, you know, healing these tanks. As we get to this third plate here, the damage that the tanks are going to be taking is going to rapidly increase. It's very significant. We also have 4 stacks of like the maximum HP reduction here. So this roll here is also very, very dangerous. Ideally, we would have a Spirit Link totem for this. I believe we use our other healer CDs as well as like some off healing here. You can see we also have that light well there. If I was better, I would be clicking the light well for that. But just like a him and some off healing there is enough to get through it. But again, ideally in your ideal composition, you'd have 3 Spirit Link totems and you'd never ever die to that roll. So you can see here, those tanks are really getting low there. I'm trying to roll my Riptides on the tank rather than focusing too hard on getting them onto the healing debuff targets. This is a really good time for your H-Pals to swap their beacons to the tanks as well, as tank deaths here are going to be much more deleterious to your group success than just a couple of random DPS potentially dying to the healing absorb. You can see I'm also doing some unleashing here. Probably not like the most ideal thing, honestly. I'm not sure if unleash spell batching with Riptide is really all that good objectively, but I think it's kind of fun to do, and I don't know, I haven't really done the math, so who knows. So we're coming to our first lift on the third plate here. And again, you can see the tanks are really getting smacked by that high stack Amalg with this low HP debuff, so very good there to keep your Riptides and your Hots and your Beacons and all that stuff on your tank. You can see there I actually click Manatide, I don't know why. Very important to be using your mana CDs on cooldown on this fight. You can see by my mana tracker over here, we're all like basically under 20% mana. This is like hugely important. Every Manatide, every Mana Hymn, every Innervate is very, very, very useful on this fight. One thing to mention here, this little green dot on my raid frames, I believe this is from Bogies. This indicates which players have the 40% DR from that yellow buff. Again, when you're dispelling, just make sure that you have that yellow debuff ending up on someone that doesn't have this green dot. Ideally, you'd want to dispel it until it gets onto the squishiest players in the raid, but usually that's not really worth the mana. As long as it goes on somebody who doesn't already have it, it's just fine. You can see here we have like, 10 of these out, which is pretty huge damage reduction on the raid. Also, if you do see like one player that has the healing debuff that has the DR and one that doesn't, you can focus first on the one that doesn't. Also, you can see there like we have a DK, the healing absorb, and he drops super low. I think he's getting meleeed by something. It can be hugely, hugely impactful and helpful for DPS players to be vigilant as to whether or not they both have the healing absorb and are low. If you are low and you do have the healing absorb, press a personal, press your health stone. Anything you can do to live and give yourself an extra bit of damage reduction is hugely, hugely impactful. You can see all the healers are like super mana gassed when it comes to this last, as we're coming to this last lift here. So yeah, any kind of like, innervate. We did have our Shadow Priest Mana Hymn there. All that stuff is very, very important. And I do have my Spirit Link here. You can see the tanks are going to be dropping pretty dangerously low here as the Amalg is dying. So I am trying to getting some mana and casting a little bit into the tanks here. Rolling my Riptide, keeping my Earth Shield up. Passive healing into the tanks during this part of the fight is very important. And I'm going to drop my SLT and we're going to kill this last tendon here. Also, something to mention is that On this very last tendon, there's going to be a huge amount of, you know, oozes being kited around here, and it can be useful to use armies, and you can see I actually run out and drop my Earth Elemental. Earth Ellies, you know, we can see we have a bunch of Earth Ellies out here. They're going to be taunting these oozes and just absorbing some of that damage. Obviously, if we do kill this tendon, the fight's over. So any kind of last-ditch stuff you could do there, armies, Earth Ellies are pretty useful. It's another reason why Resto Shaman is powerful in this fight. So that's Resto Shaman POV Spine. One more thing to mention here is I'm actually going to go back to this roll here. You can see we have a debuff bouncing around during this roll. It would probably be better for us to just allow this debuff to sit as we're healing. You can see that's what I'm doing now, where we're just letting that debuff sit for a while during the roll. You have a long time to dispel that debuff. It isn't super dangerous to have a red out there until it's like maybe 7, 8 seconds duration. You can really keep it just sitting on somebody while you heal through that roll, or, you know, during a tendon lift or something. Don't be afraid to let that red debuff sit a little while if players are low and in danger. As long as it doesn't expire while it's red, you know, you won't wipe the raid. So not a huge deal there. So that's Spine, not too bad. You know, the play patterns here are not really super complicated, and as a healer, there's not too much you really have to pay attention to, because you don't really have to be involved too much in ad management. All right, so to close here, I'm just going to really quickly go over some gearing stuff, just like very loose, like trinkets and tier stuff. So for Holy and Disc, I'd recommend using the Firelands 4 set for this. Just the AoE healing and the mana sustain is really, really nice on this. Unless you have, like, obviously some really high 410 off pieces or the 410 new tier. For trinkets, for Disc, I'd run Heart of the Unliving and Windward. For Holy, I'd run Heart of the Unliving and Jaws. And if you can, like, Reforge or whatever, I would definitely Reforge towards Spirit Crit for Disc, and towards obviously Heavy Spirit for Holy Priest, and, you know, your haste spray points. For Druid, it's just going to be the standard FL4 set, unless you know, of course, have 2-piece Heroic for your new tier, and then your trinkets are just going to be the standard Jaws Heart. I'd run Ma on like every healer on this fight. For Holy Paladin on this fight, unless you again have like some Heroic tier pieces, I just run double 2 set. For the mana sustain, the mana on that 2 set FL is really nice. But again, obviously, if you do have some like Heroic tier pieces, you will run that 4 set. The 5% Holy Radiance is pretty good here. For trinkets, I just run like the full sustained Spirit Stacking Heart and Fall of Mortality, unless you have like a full Heroic eye level Windward Heart, which you could potentially take over Fall of Mortality. Or if you really like the haste proc trinket, I don't really like the haste proc trinket on Paladin, but it's okay here. I just prefer to have that like extra spirit, or the Windward is just, the proc is a little bit nicer in my opinion. Resto Shaman gearing is a little bit interesting on this one. For trinkets, I just run like Heart, and if you don't have like a Heroic level like haste proc trinket or something like that, I would just run like Fall, or even potentially your Dark Moon card Tsunami to get that extra spirit. The reason why you want to be stacking these spirit trinkets on this fight so hard is just to get a huge amount of value out of your Mana Tide totem. Getting that on all your healers on this fight. This is a highly mana intensive fight. It's very good to have very high spirit rating on this fight. For tier, normally I'd run like for your Prebis, I just run the FL4 set, but for this fight specifically, even if you only have Raidfinder eye level tier and you don't have any like Heroic or normal eye level pieces of the new tier, I'd recommend running that new 4 set for the extra cooldown on Spirit Walker's Grace. Because so much of the danger of death on this fight is concentrated in those rolls and inside of the amalgamation deaths, where there's like bursts of damage with the debuffs out. Having an extra big throughput CD on attunement is very, very nice. I'd recommend saving that Spirit Walker's Grace for when you are rolling, because you can pop it to both get a throughput increase as well as getting that extra benefit of being able to cast while you're moving into the grip for the roll and moving out of the grip for the roll. You can just have 100% uptime, keep your healing rain down, chain healing, healing waving while you're moving. I would also recommend, again, just reforging for maximum spirit on this fight, both for your own mana sustain as well as for the added value on the raid on your Mana Tide totems. So that's gearing and trinkets for this fight. Pretty standard across the board, except, you know, Disc, I'd again recommend just going lower haste for this fight. One last little thing to mention about this fight, it can be very useful, especially if you're a Resto Shaman or a Disc Priest, where you're going to be doing damage to heal, to have a targeting macro for the tendons, as well as potentially even for the amalgamation as well. Tab targeting on this fight doesn't really work very well because there's like millions of oozes everywhere, and also just tab targeting on the tendons specifically just doesn't really work. So personally, I add a /target burning tendons line into my extra action bar macro, and then I have a secondary macro to target amalgs, although usually I'm just lazy and I'll just like click the amalg nameplate. Again, both of those macros are very, very useful in this fight for everyone, DPS, tanks, and healers, although specifically they're for Resto Shaman and Disc Priest. So that's the spine guide. Again, I didn't go super in depth into every single possible strategy here, mostly just focusing on the healer specifically. If you enjoyed the video, if you have any questions, like, subscribe, comment, etc. I also do have a Discord server link below if you have any like log review requests or further questions. Thanks for watching.
Swobu, Zug Zug.